Recent developments in Chinese military leadership structure and institutional reorganization have attracted significant analysis regarding their implications for military effectiveness and strategic decision-making processes. The People's Liberation Army has undergone substantial personnel changes at senior levels, alongside broader institutional reforms aimed at modernizing command structures and operational capabilities. These changes occur within the context of regional security dynamics and broader strategic competition that affects multiple aspects of Chinese military development and strategic positioning. This analysis will examine three key dimensions of Chinese military institutional development. First, we will assess the documented leadership changes and their relationship to broader military modernization objectives. Second, we will analyze the structural factors that affect military institutional effectiveness and coordination capabilities. Third, we will explore the implications of current developments for regional security dynamics and strategic stability considerations. The factual foundation begins with confirmed changes in Chinese military leadership across multiple service branches and institutional levels. The Central Military Commission, which serves as the highest military decision-making body, has experienced significant personnel changes over recent years. These changes have affected leadership positions across different service branches, including ground forces, naval forces, air forces, and strategic rocket forces responsible for nuclear and missile capabilities. Official Chinese statements characterize these personnel changes as part of ongoing institutional reform and anti-corruption efforts aimed at improving military effectiveness and institutional integrity. The Chinese government has consistently emphasized that military modernization requires institutional reforms alongside technological advancement and training improvements. These reforms are presented as necessary steps for developing professional military institutions capable of meeting contemporary security challenges. The scope of leadership changes extends across multiple organizational levels and functional areas within the Chinese military structure. Personnel changes have affected operational commands, educational institutions, research and development organizations, and administrative structures. The breadth of these changes reflects systematic institutional reform rather than isolated personnel decisions, according to official Chinese characterizations. Military modernization programs represent substantial institutional transformation beyond personnel changes. These programs involve new equipment acquisition, training method updates, operational doctrine development, and organizational structure modifications. The integration of these different modernization elements requires coordination across multiple institutional levels and functional areas within the military organization. Training and exercise patterns demonstrate Chinese military emphasis on joint operations, high-technology integration, and complex scenario preparation. Large-scale exercises involve multiple service branches and test coordination capabilities under various operational conditions. These exercises provide observable data regarding Chinese military capabilities and institutional coordination effectiveness, though their relationship to actual combat effectiveness remains a subject of analytical debate. The strategic context involves Chinese assessment of regional security challenges and requirements for military capability development. Official Chinese policy documents emphasize defensive deterrence while acknowledging the need for military capabilities that can respond to various potential threat scenarios. This policy framework affects military institutional development priorities and resource allocation decisions. Regional security dynamics influence Chinese military development through interactions with neighboring countries and broader strategic competition considerations. The presence of American military forces in the region, alliance relationships among regional partners, and territorial disputes create security environment conditions that affect Chinese military planning and capability requirements. The core analytical question centers on how institutional reform and personnel changes affect military organizational effectiveness and strategic decision-making quality. Military institutions require balance between centralized command authority and decentralized operational flexibility to function effectively under complex conditions. The optimal institutional arrangement depends on specific operational requirements and strategic environments that military organizations must address. The mechanism through which leadership changes affect institutional performance operates through multiple channels, including decision-making processes, coordination capabilities, and organizational culture. Concentrated authority can improve decision speed and policy consistency, but may reduce information flow and Institutional resilience. The effectiveness of centralized versus decentralized military organization depends on specific operational requirements and environmental conditions. Experience and training factors affect military institutional capability through both individual competency and organizational learning processes. Professional military development requires combination of theoretical knowledge, practical training, and operational experience to develop effective decision-making capabilities. The availability of relevant experience affects both individual leader effectiveness and institutional learning capacity. Technological integration challenges require military institutions to adapt organizational structures and operational procedures to effectively utilize advanced equipment and systems. Modern military effectiveness depends on coordination between human organizations and technological systems that requires extensive training and institutional adaptation. The pace of technological change creates ongoing adaptation requirements for military institutions. The key variable here often receives insufficient attention in public analysis. Military institutional effectiveness depends on the quality of information flow and decision-making processes rather than simply organizational structure or equipment capabilities. The ability to accurately assess situations, coordinate complex operations, and adapt to unexpected circumstances requires institutional cultures and procedures that support effective information processing and decision implementation. Strategic competition. Dynamics create pressure for rapid capability development that may conflict with requirements for thorough institutional development and preparation. The tension between speed and thoroughness in military development affects both capability acquisition and institutional effectiveness. Rushing institutional changes may create short-term improvements while reducing long-term institutional resilience. This creates constraints on military development where competing priorities must be balanced against available resources and timeframes. Political pressure for rapid capability improvement may conflict with professional military assessment of development requirements and timelines. The management of these tensions affects both immediate capability and long-term institutional sustainability. Now, the second-order effects become apparent in broader strategic stability and regional security calculations. Changes in Chinese military institutional effectiveness affect deterrence dynamics and strategic stability through altered capability assessments and strategic behavior patterns. Regional partners adjust their own military planning and strategic calculations based on assessments of Chinese military development trajectories. Alliance coordination among regional partners reflects assessments of changing military balance and strategic competition dynamics. Enhanced Chinese military capabilities or institutional effectiveness could influence alliance coordination patterns and defense spending priorities among regional countries. Conversely, perceived Chinese military institutional challenges might affect regional strategic calculations differently. Strategic communication and deterrence effectiveness depend partly on external assessments of military institutional capability and decision-making quality. The credibility of deterrent threats requires perceptions of both capability and willingness to use military force effectively. Institutional changes that affect either capability or decision-making effectiveness influence deterrence, dynamics, and strategic stability. International military cooperation patterns may shift based on assessments of relative military institutional effectiveness and strategic reliability. Countries make partnership decisions based partly on military capability assessments that include institutional effectiveness, alongside equipment capabilities. Changes in institutional effectiveness affect partnership value calculations and cooperation priorities. The learning and adaptation processes within military institutions require time and resources that may compete with other development priorities. Institutional learning from external conflicts, exercises, and technology development requires careful analysis and adaptation that may not align with political timelines or strategic pressure. The effectiveness of learning processes affects long-term institutional development regardless of immediate capability changes. We can identify three plausible scenarios for Chinese military institutional development based on current trends and structural factors. The successful modernization scenario involves effective integration of personnel changes with broader institutional reforms that enhance military effectiveness and strategic capabilities. This outcome requires successful balance between centralized authority and institutional functionality. Early indicators for this scenario include improved coordination in military exercises, successful integration of new technologies and operational concepts, and maintained institutional stability despite personnel changes. External recognition of enhanced Chinese military capabilities and strategic effectiveness would support assessments of successful institutional development. The institutional stress scenario emerges if personnel changes and reform pressures create coordination problems or institutional dysfunction that reduces military effectiveness despite equipment improvements. This could result from excessive centralization that reduces institutional flexibility, inadequate time for institutional adaptation, or loss of institutional knowledge through extensive personnel changes. Key indicators include coordination problems in military exercises, delayed implementation of modernization programs, or evidence of internal institutional tensions affecting operational effectiveness. Reduced confidence among regional partners or adversaries regarding Chinese military capabilities would suggest institutional effectiveness problems. The gradual adaptation scenario involves mixed outcomes where institutional reforms provide some improvements while creating ongoing adaptation challenges that require extended development periods. This outcome reflects the complexity of military institutional reform and the time required for effective integration of organizational and technological changes. Indicators for this scenario include uneven progress across different military functional areas, continued institutional experimentation and adjustment, and gradual rather than dramatic changes in external assessments of Chinese military capabilities. Sustained reform efforts without major institutional crises would characterize this evolutionary approach. Each scenario carries distinct implications for regional security dynamics and strategic stability. Successful modernization would enhance Chinese deterrent capabilities while potentially creating pressure for enhanced military development among regional partners. This outcome could strengthen Chinese strategic position while increasing regional military competition intensity. Institutional stress could create strategic instability through reduced deterrent effectiveness or increased risk of miscalculation during crises. Military institutional problems could encourage more aggressive strategic behavior to compensate for institutional weaknesses or create vulnerability perceptions that affect strategic calculations. Gradual adaptation would maintain current strategic dynamics while creating uncertainty about future capability trajectories. Extended institutional development periods could provide time for regional strategic adjustment, while maintaining competitive pressure for military development among all regional actors. Our analysis reveals several confirmed patterns and areas requiring continued monitoring. Military institutional reform represents complex processes that require balancing competing priorities and managing multiple, interdependent changes simultaneously. The effectiveness of institutional changes depends on implementation quality and adaptation to specific operational requirements rather than simply organizational structure modifications. The relationship between personnel changes and institutional effectiveness varies depending on specific organizational contexts and implementation approaches. Military institutions require continuity alongside change to maintain operational effectiveness while adapting to new requirements and capabilities. However, the complexity of military institutional development means that assessment of reform effectiveness requires extended observation periods and multiple performance indicators. Short-term outcomes may not accurately reflect long-term institutional development trajectories or strategic implications. We will continue monitoring confirmed military exercise outcomes, official policy statements, and observable capability development patterns as indicators of institutional effectiveness and strategic development trends. The relationship between military institutional reform and strategic competition provides insights into contemporary challenges of military modernization and strategic stability management.